Today we're continuing the series we've been in called Prepare the Way. We've been talking as we move towards Easter, as we move towards Good Friday and Easter and all these big moments and the life of the church globally, historically, for thousands of years. We've been asking the question, how did this one man change all of human history? How did one life, we've seen throughout history, one life can make a big difference, but there's been no one life that's impacted all of human history like the life of Jesus. And we as Christians believe that's the case because he's God's own son, come in the flesh, that actually God was interrupting human history, that he was changing the direction that human history was going by his own design. So in that way we say he wasn't just a man who impacted history, and yet all the people who walked and talked with him, they just saw him as a man in their own life, but then went and gave their lives for him from there forward. Today, we're going to shift our focus. We've been in the life of Jesus from his first moment of ministry to several different moments that we've been ticking through in his life. Last week, we talked about the story of the woman who came and brought this perfume and anointed Jesus' feet, and all the people thought that feels extravagant, that feels over the top, and Jesus stopped them and said, let her do what she's come to do because she's come to prepare me for my burial. We begin to turn our focus towards the cross and what he ultimately came to do with the mission of his life. And today, we're going to begin just over this next week. We're going to lead you starting today, then Friday, and Sunday. We're going to lead through just the final hours and days of Jesus' life. Today, we're going to be on a Thursday and a moment we call the Last Supper. In fact, if you have a Bible this morning, you can open with me to Matthew chapter 26, verse 17 to 30 is what we're going to be reading and talking about here today, an incredibly significant moment. So today we're going to be in this last moment on a Thursday, right before he's about to be arrested, and about the whole chain reaction of dominoes are about to fall that's going to lead to him being crucified upon a cross, and then him being buried in a tomb, left for dead, understood to be dead as he was dead, and then to rise again on the third day on Easter when we come back together next Sunday. You know, life is filled with defining moments, isn't it? There's moments in our life where we don't even see them coming, but they end up changing the trajectory of our life. I was thinking this week back to when I met Christina at Oral Roberts University just down the street, and we were in what's called the Eagle's Nest. I don't know if the Eagle's Nest still survived there on ORU, but we were in the Eagle's Nest, and we were down there, and I was talking with people that I knew. It was like 2 weeks into school, and we were meeting people, and I didn't know anybody in Oklahoma, so you got to make friends quick. If you show up at a school in a state, in a city you've never really been to before. And so I was meeting people, and she was meeting people, and somebody that I had met, she had met, and we were in this one moment in this cafeteria, coffee shop area, and I was introduced to this woman named Christina Levitt. And in that moment, my life changed, right? Now, I didn't see it coming, and even when the moment came, I didn't fully grasp that it was a life-changing moment. It was just like all the other moments that have happened over the couple of weeks leading up to it. And yet, that moment ended up opening up a whole future of our life to the point at which 2 months from now, a little bit less than 2 months from now, we will have our fourth child. Yes, okay. Put your hands together for Christina. I haven't done a whole lot up to this point. Sometimes we don't see those moments coming. We don't see the significance of them. We don't know how much they're going to change our life. And you in this room, you've had those moments too, whether it's meeting a loved one, having a child, moving to a new location, taking a job you didn't expect. There's all kinds of defining moments. Am I going to go this way or am I going to go that way? Am I going to think this way or think that way? And all the choices that end up coming out of one moment in our life can end up being defining moments for our life that change everything about the rest of our life. The story we're going to read today on this Thursday in what we call the Last Supper ends up being a defining moment for the disciples. And when I say that, I don't mean in the moment it was defining. I mean after the moment, they looked back and realized that it was defining. They looked back after everything the rest of the week's going to happen. This is actually going to be a sad moment, a sorrowful moment, a confusing moment as Jesus describes what's happening and how he's changing everything that they've ever understood about their faith. And then he's going to go to a cross, and they're really not going to understand that. And then they're going to bury him, and they're really not going to understand that. And then he's going to raise again on the third day, and they're like, we would like to understand that, right? And they're going to think, but remember on Thursday what he said to us. Because what he said to us was bigger than we understood in the moment. It was more life-changing than we understood in the moment. It has now deepened our faith for them more than they could have ever imagined possible. And for us today, as we read it, we're not going to read just a historical event. We're just going to think about it as history. We're going to see what they learned, and we're going to have the opportunity to deepen our faith, deepen our understanding. I'm going to say a couple things today, and you're going to be like, I've never understood that fully. I hope that we can connect some dots here today between what Jesus has always been doing throughout human history, did with the Israelites as they came out of Egypt, and how that then helped them to understand what he was doing when he went to a cross and died for all of humanity, and one great act of heroism and deliverance and rescue that Jesus accomplished when he went to the cross. Matthew chapter 26, verse 17, it says, on the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, we won't talk about that today, too many details there, but the disciples came to Jesus and asked, where do you want us to make preparations for you to eat the Passover? We will talk about that today. And he replied, go into the city to a certain man and tell him, the teacher says, my appointed time is near. I'm going to celebrate the Passover with my disciples at your house. So the disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover. When evening came, Jesus was reclining at the table with the 12. And while they were eating, he said, truly I tell you, one of you will betray me. They were very sad and began to say to him, one after the other, surely you don't mean me, Lord. Jesus replied, the one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me. The Son of Man will go just as it is written about him, but woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born. Then Judas, the one who would betray him, said, surely you don't mean me, Rabbi. By the way, he's the only one that calls him Rabbi in the story. The rest call him Lord. They have a deeper appreciation for who he is, but Judas begins to show that he's conflicted about his beliefs about Jesus, and he calls him Rabbi. Jesus answered, you have said so. While they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it, and he gave it to his disciples, saying, take and eat. This is my body. Then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink from this fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. When they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Everything that had happened in Jesus' life, and really everything that had happened in all of human history, was leading up to this moment that we read right here at the Last Supper. Everything had been engineered leading up to an understanding of how God works, how he thinks, what he's doing up to this moment right here. Within hours, Jesus is going to be betrayed. Not just betrayed by people who didn't know him, but betrayed by one of his 12 disciples, one of his closest friends, one of the ones who are closest to him. Hard for us to understand of all the people who shouldn't betray him. You would think one of the ones who was closest to him wouldn't betray him, but Judas, right there at the dinner table, Jesus says, one of you is going to betray me, and they go around one by one. By the way, they had all dipped their bread in the cup with him. That's how dinners would have worked. They would have all done it. He said, the one who has dipped his bread in the cup with me, they're like, is that me, Lord? I hope that that's not me. And they go around. Well, Judas is going to betray him. Immediately after that, he's going to be arrested by the chief priests, the religious leaders. He's going to be taken away in chains, almost like he's some common criminal out to hurt other people. And he's going to be arrested in that moment. On this Thursday evening, he's going to be tried overnight by the Sanhedrin, the religious leaders, the one who are supposed to lead the way and point the way towards God. And eventually be tried by Pilate, who's a Roman official who had no care for God, didn't care about the things of God, and yet he's going to try Jesus and hold his life in his hand, so he thinks in that moment. But in this moment, Jesus says, this isn't a fearful moment for me. Luke chapter 22, the same story written by a different gospel author, he says to them, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. You see, Jesus saw this moment. They're on this wild ride with Jesus, right? I mean, if you're with Jesus, you kind of end up in places you didn't expect and conversations you don't understand, being asked questions by him that you don't know how to answer them, people trying to trick Jesus, but him tricking them back. Jesus always has people on an adventure. Everybody feels a little uneven around Jesus all the time. And in this moment, he says to them, I've eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. The first part they got, the Passover, what a great moment in Jewish history where God had delivered his people from bondage and slavery. They're like, we get that. We want to eat it with you. You're our rabbi. You're our teacher. You're our Lord. You're the one that's going to help us understand the great things of God that happened 1,000+ years before this moment. But he knew he eagerly delighted to eat it with them for a deeper reason. And then he added, before I suffer, which they didn't like as much in the story. His whole life had led to this moment, the reason he was born, the reason he lived, the reason he walked among us, the reason that he taught and healed and cared for people. It was all leading to this moment where he would suffer what we call the passion, his suffering. That's what the passion means. His passion was coming. His suffering was coming. And he had eagerly waited for this moment from how long? From the beginning of time. The Bible says before Adam and Eve ever drew their first breath, before the foundations of the world were laid, it says the Lamb was slain from the very beginning. Talk about a long wait, right? He said, I've eagerly awaited for me to come and complete what I designed to do from the very beginning of time. So all of his life had led here, and all of human history, really, a broken human history, where Adam and Eve had decided to rebel against God, and not just Adam and Eve, but every person, place, and time had chosen on their own to rebel against God. That includes us. That includes our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, the ones that go way before us. Every person in every place at all times in history had rebelled against God. All of human history, though they didn't know what to look for, was waiting for a moment where God would change things for the better, would heal what was broken, would make things right that were wrong once and for all. And so in this moment at the Last Supper, Jesus looks at them and says, I need to make sure and prepare you for what's about to happen. I need to make sure and prepare you to understand what it means when I go and die upon the cross. And you're not going to even understand it in that moment, but maybe a few days later, you will understand it and you'll think back to this moment when I ate one last time with you and spoke about the Passover, just exactly what I came to accomplish. Okay? That's a lot of setup, right? It builds this moment. This is a reality. All centers around this feast, this idea of the Passover. So what is the Passover? The Passover is when the children of Israel, they were in slavery in Egypt, and they were in bondage, and they were being treated horribly, and they thought that God had forgotten them, and they began to lose even their way and their expectation that God would care for them. And so they seemed in no man's land with no hope in their future, no way to change the environment and their context for how they were living. They were enchained physically to those who had them in bondage. And God came to Moses and said, I'm going to use you. And he said, please use somebody else. God says, no, I'm going to use you. I'm going to use you to let my people go out of bondage once and for all. And Moses says, okay, Lord, at the end, and submits to that. God uses him. He goes down to Egypt. He goes to Pharaoh and says, Pharaoh, let my people go. And Pharaoh says, look, I don't know who you think you are, right? But I'm not letting a free workforce of 1 million people leave Egypt, because that would cripple our economy, cripple our future, cripple everything that's happening around. I'm not going to let the people go. And Moses says, well, bad things are coming then. And we have all these plagues that happen where it begins to show that God is stronger than Pharaoh, that all the gods they worship are nothing in comparison to the only true God, the God who had sent Moses into Egypt. So they have these plagues and they're unfolding. By the time the 9th plague comes, Pharaoh's like, look, you can go. We'd like you to go. Then he changes his mind. He's all over the place in the story. And they realize that Pharaoh's not going to soften his heart. And God says, well, then we reserve the worst plague of all for the end. is the plague on the firstborn. And he says, look, I must bring judgment on a people who won't listen to me, who won't do what I ask them to do, won't let my people go. And he says, tonight I'm going to come through the land, and the firstborn is going to die of every family. It's just a terrible plague. There's no way to explain it that makes us feel great about it. It's not a gentle ask of Pharaoh to let the people go. He says, you're not listening. There's only one way I can get your attention, and that is to take your firstborns from you. And in the moment, God says, but there is a way out of it. If you'll soften your heart and finally do something I tell you to do, if you'll take a lamb, an unblemished lamb, pure lamb, if you'll take a lamb and you'll take its life, then it can stand in the gap for your life, for your son's life, for your firstborn's life. If you'll take one lamb and take the blood of that lamb, and if you'll paint it on the doorpost of your home, then when the angel of death comes through the land and sees the blood on the doorpost of your home, it will know that you listen to God, that you do what God says, and that someone has died in the place of need to bring judgment on your whole family. This is the Passover. And so then from there on, every year, year after year, the people of Israel were supposed to celebrate and remember the Passover, that great moment when God came through the land, saw the blood on the doorpost of their home and says, look, that's one of ours, and passed over them. You hear that? Passed over their household when it saw the blood and went on to the next household and went throughout all the land that day. And then at the end of it, Pharaoh, after all these firstborns have died in Egypt, judgment of God, the wrath of God, the anger of God, it's all throughout the scriptures, comes through. Pharaoh says, please go. And they go. And they exit Egypt. We call it the Exodus, right? Where they exited Egypt. They ran for their lives in some way because the Pharaoh changes his mind again. That's Pharaoh. But they're running for their lives, and they get out, and the Red Sea parts, and they go into the promised land eventually, and God completes this great task that he has for them. So right here in this moment, as they prepare the Passover during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, they're preparing the Passover to remember God passed over us. God protected us. God rescued us. He delivered us. He brought us out of bondage to slavery. It was the greatest act in their mind of all of their history as a people, that God not only chose them, but he saw them, and he helped them to exit from where they had been in bondage once and for all. And so there at dinner, they're looking at their rabbi, their Lord, who's going to lead them through what they've been led through since they were little children as they learn the Passover. Just like our children today, they come to church on Easter, and we hope they're not leaving thinking only about candy or about Easter bunnies and all those things. We're trying to deepen the thoughts. What is Easter all about? So that one day when they grow up and they take their kids to Easter, they're whispering to them the ideas of Jesus' death and his resurrection, right? That's why same thing for them. They would have been at Passover after Passover, and they had a liturgy. They had a way that they walked through the Passover together where they talk about this and pray through this and take these cups, and this cup means that, and they do this whole process, and Jesus is leading them through that here on a Thursday. But then Jesus goes off script, and he stops doing the exact liturgy they have always done before, and he begins to talk about his own body. He says, this is my body. And you can imagine in the moment, they were like, what do you mean that's not how you say that? Of course, nobody would speak up to Jesus in a moment like that. This is my body, he says. And he goes off script and he says, this is my blood. Like, we don't really know what you're saying, Jesus, because this is really about a moment we're remembering from 1,000+ years before. And Jesus begins to say to them and explain this bigger story that's been happening for a very long time, that God started through the Exodus, but was beginning to really tell them about the coming death of his son Jesus one day. And Jesus begins to proclaim himself as the Passover lamb. He said, we're here not just to remember lambs who were slain or to slay a lamb and do the ritual again. We're here to realize that the Passover lamb that we looked to so long ago was actually pointing to me. that was really not even about fully you coming out of Egypt. It was about a people one day coming out of bondage to sin and death. That I was starting a process, I was beginning a story that had this great introduction, and you thought the introduction was sort of the end of the story, but the introduction was just the introduction. That now we're in the heart, the climax of the story, that everything that's been said beforehand has all been leading to this moment, and here I am with my disciples. And he says, we're not just celebrating something that happened in the past. This is my body. This is my blood. I am that Passover lamb, and my blood, if it's on the doorpost of your heart, right? If it's painted on your heart, then at the end of time when judgment comes to humanity, and Jesus talked about the judgment coming to humanity many times, when judgment comes, then God will come and he will pass over you when he comes to bring judgment on all people. Here we are at the Last Supper. Jesus says, there is a new Passover that we celebrate here today and this weekend and for the rest of your life. You don't need just to look to the past. A new Passover has come where God will one day forever pass over judgment on people. And not only that, but a new Exodus is coming. That it wasn't just about people coming out of slavery, physical slavery to a physical people. It was about all of humanity having the opportunity, if they would choose to follow God with their life, the opportunity to then live a new Exodus, where they would come out of bondage to sin, where they couldn't choose differently, where they would hurt their loved ones, where they would make choices that harm themselves and harm those around them, that didn't have to be their story any longer, that God could then remove them from the slavery and the bondage of their own decision-making once and for all. A new Exodus in which one day we would come out of this world even, this human world that one day we'll look back on and see as slavery and bondage. That one day a new Exodus would come where he would take us from this world to the promised land, where we could be with him forever and ever and realize, I get it now. It wasn't the way it was supposed to be. It wasn't as God designed it from the beginning. It was a broken place, a wrong place, a new Passover, a new Exodus. And so Jesus is sitting there with them and he says, I've got a big story to tell you, but you're not quite ready for all the facts, so I'm going to lay a few things out there, and you're going to remember them later, and you're going to talk about them later. But here's something. This is my body, and this is my blood. So we say, how does the Passover and the cross connect? Well, the Passover and the cross are incredibly connected for all of time, and God knew that and was planning that in advance, telling the story, unfolding it chapter by chapter. And here in this chapter, on the next day would have been Passover. They're actually a little bit early on a Thursday. Thursday is not when you celebrate Passover. They kind of speed it up a little bit because Jesus knows this is his last chance to eat with them. And on the Friday is Passover. So there would have been lambs being slaughtered all across the countryside on a Friday while Jesus was being slaughtered upon a cross. You don't think that detail would be lost on them? Like, I am the Passover lamb. In fact, we'll say this morning, Jesus became the once for all Passover lamb upon the cross. That's what he came to do. He came to become that Passover lamb for all of time, unblemished. Remember in the Old Testament, unblemished lamb, unblemished Christ, without sin, with no need for death, no need for judgment. This shouldn't come upon him. He gave his life as the lamb on behalf of all humanity that would receive that free gift and allow his blood to cover their sin and need for judgment. And so we say this morning, Jesus ends up being the fulfillment of everything that was ever said, the completion of all that was said. It's not that that was wrong or off track. It was like the seed for what was actually going to one day grow and be more meaningful than before. So Jesus said, I've come to complete what we're celebrating here today. He said, I know we thought we're just here to talk about something that happened over 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, 1,800 years ago. But I'm actually the completion of that event. I am the fulfillment of that event. I am the Passover lamb, and I am initiating an entirely new exodus for all of humanity. And so Jesus becomes this once and for all. And like every year, they'd have the Passover lamb. But Jesus on this day says, we don't need Passover lambs anymore. I am the Passover lamb. I'm the once, only one time needed, for all people. You don't have to have another sacrifice. The next person doesn't have to have another sacrifice. We don't have to have hundreds of sacrifices in this room right now, or thousands or millions. We don't need to do that anymore. Christ Jesus, by his own blood ends up being the once and for all Passover lamb for all of humanity. And so they will look back. That's why the believers, as they were Jewish believers and they came through Judaism, they stopped offering sacrifices because they realized it is done. It is finished. Everything that God said for us to do is not that it was obsolete or didn't matter, it's that it's been completed. It's been finalized. It's been done once and for all with no need any further. And so they would stop offering sacrifices from that moment forward because they said, our Jesus who stood in our place, he did something for us that we couldn't have done for ourselves. That the blood of lambs and goats, as the Bible said, could never have forgiven us sins. It was just pointing to the idea that one day one would come that could. And Jesus looks at them and said, this is my blood. This is my body, poured out for the forgiveness of people everywhere. I love the complexity of God's thinking, and I love the complexity of the scriptures, because I've spent the last 20 years, and people gone before me spent many years even more than I have, but I spent 20 years just studying the Bible, and I just find layer upon layer upon layer of God's instruction, of his teaching, of the symbolism, of God's design, of his advanced planning, of his intentions, of his goodness, of his mercy, in every bit of the Bible. Somebody was saying to me the other day, I was saying, I've preached long enough, though I prepare much more. I said, I think probably I could open the Bible and preach on almost any passage. They're like, yeah. I was like, even if you gave me like a Leviticus passage, I probably could preach on it on Sunday. Why? Because there's just so much there, like mining for diamonds. And the Last Supper, Jesus is trying to help them not miss it, but to mine for the diamonds that are there. And then he'll go die on a cross during Passover, and his blood will be spilled, and God will offer that as the remedy for the judgment that is to come on all of humanity. In Luke chapter 22, and on many communion tables and many places, maybe you've seen this growing up or in other places, it says, do this in remembrance of me, right? Do this in remembrance of me. Jesus said, this is my body, this is my blood. You've been doing it in remembrance of the past, but from now on, I want you to do it in remembrance of me. Why do we share in this thing called communion as Christians? Why is that important to us? It's important because it's one of the very few things that Jesus commanded us to do, other than in our character and our lifestyle and the way we treat people, in terms of an action we are to take. It's one of the very few things. He said, go into all the world and baptize and teach and lead people into relationship with me. But as well, he says, do this in remembrance of me. And so when we get together as churches, we sing, we give together, we open the Bible together, we do all these critical, basic elements of what it looks like for us to follow Jesus more. But this is the one he said to do in remembrance of me, almost more with more clarity than any of the rest that we have picked up and done as a people. Why communion? Communion's about remembrance. I mean, at the end of the day, it's about remembering. What are we remembering? We're remembering just how high the stakes were and just who we were and how separated we were from God beforehand. And I don't know where everybody is spiritually here today. I wish I did. I wish I knew every person's story in this room. It would help me tailor everything we're talking about. But I'll bet in a room this size, and every Sunday that we're here, there's people here, you're not quite sure where you are in your faith. You're not sure quite what you believe. Maybe you used to believe strongly. You don't believe as strongly as you used to. Or maybe you never had anybody teach you anything, and now you're beginning to discover things for yourself and try to ask questions. I'm glad you're doing that. You should ask those questions, and you shouldn't take everything just blindly, but to wrestle with it and think about it and ponder on all those things to strengthen the decisions you end up making. But as a Christian, I know that my separation from God was so great that Jesus was going to have to interrupt it. And so when I take of communion, this thing that he said to do in remembrance of him, to do in remembrance of the Last Supper, to do in remembrance of the cross of Jesus Christ, I do it in remembrance of my sin. I do it in remembrance of my need. I do it in remembrance of just how far apart we were from the very beginning. And that's critically important to it. I do it as well in remembrance of what he did, right? Not just who I was, but what he did. He willingly came to earth, lived, died, bled upon a cross, gave his life, sat with his disciples, said, my body and blood's going to stand in the gap for you for all of eternity. He did it willingly, and he did it for me. And so in communion, I remember my need, my sin, and I remember Jesus and the cross, and I remember the gospel, and I remember that I don't have to earn it, and I remember I can't earn it. I remember I don't have to clean myself up, and I remember that I really can't clean myself up enough to stand with a holy God. But instead, I remember that he did it for me, and he cleaned me up. He made my heart pure. He forgave my sins. And he stood in the gap and said, take my blood and put it on your life. And when God sees my blood on your heart and on your life, he'll say, he's with me. Communion goes by a couple different words. One of them is communion. Why do we say communion? We say it because we're communing. We're connecting with God, and we're connecting with God's people. That's one of the ways we describe it. Eucharist is a different explanation, a different word. Each of these have their own dimensions that bring out different things. Eucharist, anybody know what Eucharist means? Eucharist means thanksgiving. What a great word. Eucharist, thanksgiving. I'm thankful for what God did. Others might say the Lord's Supper, right? From this story that we're reading right here, the Lord's Supper, why do we say that? Because it speaks to the Passover. It speaks to God sitting down through Jesus Christ with his disciples that day. All these bring out different pieces of what happens. But at the end of the day, communion is about remembering Jesus and remembering the gospel. And I was thinking this week in the life of Anthem Church and how we celebrate that on a weekly basis and how we make that sort of the exclamation point of our service. I don't know if you see it that way or you thought of it that way, but everything in my mind as your pastor is building up to an exclamation point of interacting with Jesus through communion. The reality is that it's hard for us to forget the gospel. Why do we do? It's hard for us to forget the gospel when we embrace the elements of communion every week. This is why we do it. Because I don't want you to forget the gospel. I don't want you to think it's about your works or just being a better person or just being a better husband or a better wife or a better son or a better daughter. And I hope all those things will happen. All those things are outgrowths of the gospel, but that's not really the gospel. The gospel is that even if you don't get better, that he is better, that he stands in your place and paid a price for you. Therefore, I want to get better, but it's not on me. That's not the gospel. Say, we don't want you to forget the gospel. And honestly, I just don't want to forget the gospel. And the amazing thing is Jesus says, do this in remembrance of me. Why? Because he doesn't want us to forget the gospel. He doesn't want us to forget what he did for us. And when we embrace those elements, whether that's in your home, whether that's at church, wherever that might be, when you do that on a regular basis, it's just hard to forget the gospel. His body was broken, okay? His blood was poured out, okay? Why? For the forgiveness of sins. He did it. It is finished. What a great work for all of us. Verse 29, if the news wasn't complicated enough for them, but it was going to get better. Verse 29, he tells them this, what sounds like sad news, but is actually great news for us as we read it today. I tell you, I will not drink from this fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. He says, until that day. This moment when he sits down with them is pointing to a future moment. He says, I'm not going to eat with you again. This is the end. This is the last supper. It's the last moment we're going to eat together. And they're like, well, I don't understand how that could be possible. I'm sure we'll eat in the morning. Jesus, can we find some food tomorrow? Why is this the last? All the things that they're going through their mind. But he said, I just want to tell you the truth. I'm not going to eat with you again until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. This moment points to a future moment. And Jesus' desire for humanity, that one day he would sit down with all of humanity, not just his 12 disciples this day, but all of humanity, and be with them closely, celebrating with thanksgiving and remembrance of their heart what God had done for them. In fact, the book of Revelation really focuses in on this idea. Revelation chapter 19, you can look it up later, talks about blessed are those who are invited to the wedding supper of the Lamb, that Passover Lamb. Blessed are those who are going to be there one day to sit with them and celebrate with him forever. And the good news of the story is this, church. One day we will sit down to enjoy a great feast with Jesus in eternity. I don't know what it'll look like, but it'll make the Last Supper look like nothing, right? Just another moment, just like all of human history. You heard me in the story. Just like everything has been pointing to the next moment, the greater moment, the more important moment, that in this moment he sits with 12, but one day he will sit with how many? 5 million. It's a good guess. At least it's got to have a B on it, minimum. Billion. Maybe more, depending on when the Lord comes back. He will sit down with all of them. He gives this vivid imagery in the Bible that this great feast has been prepared and has been waiting for the one day when the church of Jesus Christ and the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords will be married in some great cosmic sense, and a great feast will be celebrated, and that feast will have no end in eternity. I mean, isn't that amazing? And he says, I'm not going to eat with you again. Sorrow comes to their heart, right? Until that day, and they're like, we don't really understand. That sounds a little bit more hopeful than the first part. But now we read it, and we go, one day, those who are followers of Jesus Christ, who have chosen to live for him, imperfect as they are, but have chosen to live with him, one day there will be a new exodus from this life and this place to the place that's prepared for us. And in that place, there'll be a great feast and a great celebration and a remembrance of what he did, and a great sense of joy and celebration will take over for all of eternity. Isn't that amazing? Yeah. And this is what Jesus is saying to them. It's our Last Supper, but I'll see you again. And it'll be better. And we won't be crying at the table. We'll be celebrating forever. This is the gospel. As I close the message today, so we're on a few-day countdown to Easter. I think it's time for us just to spend some time with the Lord this week, right? To prepare our hearts, to not just go through the motion. Another week, another Easter, another Good Friday, whatever it might be, and just go through the motions, but to sit down and say, God, will you help me remember? Will you help me remember exactly what was accomplished, exactly the price you paid for me, exactly the joy that's placed in the middle of the story? Will you help me remember that though I'm going through pain and hardship in this life, that one day I will go on to be with you in the life that is to come? Will you help me remember all of that? And if you'll do it, your heart will grow this week, and we'll get to Easter and we'll just blow the roof off the building, right? With our energy and joy in this place, because we'll have remembered what Jesus did for us. As we close the service in just a moment, we're going to share in communion together. What do? We remember our sin. We confess our sin. We repent of sin. We remember how separated we were from God, or maybe in this room, if you're not a follower of Jesus, how separated even in this moment, honestly, in some sense, you're separated from God. You remember that. You remember that Jesus came and he died for you of his own willing choice. And you remember the gospel. And that's why we meet. And that's why we're here. Let's stand to our feet and let's pray.